Right, okay, everyone. So we're going to get into hour three. We're going to start with Germany. So as I've said, you're going to be doing a full paper one and a mock exam. So hour one, Germany. Hour two, conflict and tension. Now, um, and I wouldn't be putting so much emphasis on this if this wasn't going to come up in some form in your mock exam. Now, I do want to say that the Kaiser Wilhelm, so when we look at Germany from 1890 up to the First World War, this is something that has been significantly under-assessed by the example. Traditionally, it was always Germany 1918 to 1945. So we would always, under the old spec, always start with Germany just at the end of the First World War and the establishment of the Weimar Republic. When they reframed the spec back in 2018, they extended it to encompass the period of the Kaiserreich. Now, up until now, I think it's only come up once as a question. What was it? A question four. Okay, just a 4-mark question. It is something that's been really underassessed, and it's I've been saying this to groups over the last 2 or 3 years. It has to come up at some point. So this is something I think we need to be really prepared for, and it is probably, out of all the content that we cover in Jim, it's probably some of the trickier content as well. So what would you need to know in terms of, as we go through the next 4 or 5 months, and as we gradually prepare not just for the mocks but for the real exams, what do you need to master in terms of Kaiser Wilhelm? You should certainly be able to explain the influence of Prussian militarism on the Kaiser's government. Now, just put this in context, of course. Germany was unified as a single kingdom for the first time in 1870, 1871. Prior to that, Germany had been a confederacy, okay, a collection of different German states working together, largely under Prussian influence. So Prussia was the largest of the old German kingdoms. Okay, not Russia, Prussia. Obviously, Berlin was the capital of Prussia, and so it was. Prussia fought 2 wars, once against the Austrians, 1864, one against the French in 1870, and by taking out its two sort of greatest rivals, Prussia was enabled to basically unify Germany as a united country for the first time in 1871. The Prussians had a reputation for always having a brilliantly organized army, and so that kind of militarism spilled over into the new Germany when it was set up in 1871. It was a big influence on Kaiser Wilhelm. Remember, he had, if you recall, he had a policy of Weltpolitik, or world politics. The Kaiser wanted to use, so this new unified Germany with its Prussian military engine, as it were, to dominate Europe, to become a major land power. And they were very interested in building an empire, looking at colonies in Africa. And he wanted an empire to rival that of his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and obviously his cousin George V. Now, the Kaiser in the early years could always rely on the Reichstag, his parliament, to pass his laws. Remember, the Reichstag was, in inverted commas, democratically elected. Males over the age of 25 were able to vote in Germany, but the Reichstag only met to consider the laws put before it by the Kaiser and his ministers. All right. Up until the 20th century, the Kaiser relied very much on his Junkers, these noble landowners, these conservatives that dominated the Reichstag, and of course, increasingly industrialists, the military. Now, what starts to happen as we go into the 20th century, because Germany's trying to become a world power, it's going through a very quick industrial revolution. And that process of industrialization created social problems. Like in Britain, the workers in the factories and the mines were exploited, were downtrodden, not paid properly, had very little sort of legal rights within the workplace. So increasingly, they start to vote for left-wing parties. And the largest of the left-wing parties in Germany at this point was the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. And the SPD, by 1914, has become the largest political party in the Reichstag, which makes it increasingly difficult for Kaiser Wilhelm to pass his laws, because the Reichstag is now less dominated by the Junkers, by the conservatives, by sort of, like the military, and far more dominated by liberal and socialist parties, and some of the socialists are advocating revolution against the Kaiser. Now, it's important to remember that the Kaiser is removed in a revolution at the end of the First World War. Okay, there's a major mutiny in the Kiel Canal, which spreads to Berlin, and he loses the support of the army. All right, so the Kaiser is, although he's abdicated, he's effectively removed in a revolution. And that revolutionary zeal was starting to become present in Germany really from 1912 onwards. Okay? Who takes power after 1918? It's the SPD under President Ebert. Okay, when Germany is transformed into a republic, the leader of the SPD, Ebert, becomes the president of Germany. So the socialists were really beginning to kind of build up as a force in the early years of the 20th century. So the Kaiser is increasingly finding Germany difficult to govern as a result. So that's the context you really need. Those are the things you need to be able to tick off with regards to sort of the essentials regarding Kaiser Wilhelm and his governance of Germany up until really the First World War. Now, don't forget, in Germany, the exam paper, the first 3 questions are based on your inserts. You will have 2 interpretations, okay? And questions 1 to 3 are based on the 2 interpretations. So this is like the type of interpretation you will get. There hasn't yet been one on Kaiser Wilhelm, so this is one I put together from William Carr's book on Germany, published quite a long time ago now in 1991. This is something you can have a go at yourself as part of your wider exam preparation. So the first question will ask you to compare the 2 interpretations, okay, and all you have to do is explain the ways in which they're different. It's really easy. 4 marks, 5 minutes. Interpretation A says this and this, and this is different to interpretation B, which says this and this. Question 2 will ask you why the interpretations differ. So for that question, you put aside the content and you simply look at provenance. Who's writing it? When was it written? What was going on when this was written? What's the context and the belief systems of the writer? So what you'll need to do is use the provenance to explain that the interpretations were written by different people at different times with different beliefs under different sets of circumstances. Dead easy. 4 marks, 5 minutes. Question 3 is the tricky one. Now, what we are going to do before Christmas, one of the booster lessons, and again, I will record it like we're doing this one. We're going to look at question 3 in Germany because that's a tricky question, because it's asking you which interpretation do you find the most convincing based on your contextual knowledge. Now, a lot of students make the mistake of simply regurgitating what they've already said in question 2. Oh, I think this is more reliable because it's written by a more reliable person. That's not what you've been asked to do. You've been asked to say, well, actually, I'm going to use my contextual knowledge to evaluate the arguments made in interpretation 1, then interpretation 2, and then based on my understanding, come to a judgment on what I think is the most convincing. What they tend to look for is, which view was more typical of the time. That's one reason why it could be convincing. Sometimes is there a correct answer? Sometimes there is. All right. There was one a few years ago where it was looking at Hitler and the Depression, and one of the arguments was, really it wasn't Hitler's sort of it wasn't so much what he was saying, It was obviously the circumstances in which he was saying it, and this historian points to, look, Hitler was saying exactly the same thing in 1923 compared to what he's saying in 1933. The difference, of course, is that in 1933 there's an economic crisis and people are more willing to listen. So in that case, that is more credible. All right. So that's the type of thing to think about when you're evaluating the interpretations. So as yet, there hasn't been any extracts of Kaiser Wilhelm. So that's one I prepared from a book I've got on, published by William Carr. And it just gives a sort of a little breakdown of the Kaiser's personality. There's a couple of things you can do there. Okay, in just the analysis part, unpicking the key arguments in the extract. What sort of view does William Carr take of Kaiser Wilhelm? Okay, so again, it just, it gets into the territory that you should be familiar with, that he was an unpredictable character. He was highly intelligent, but he was highly unpredictable, highly emotional, quite volatile. I guess we'd say in modern terms, wasn't able to self-regulate. He had a terrible temper. Probably, didn't really have the temperament to be the leader of one of the most powerful countries in Central Europe at the time. So he was quite sort of a volatile individual, albeit a very intelligent one. And that's the kind of the view that's being communicated in that extract. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just briefly talk you through a potential question 5, and we're going to have a go again at just completing a P paragraph. So question 5, so you got your first questions 1 to 3 are your interpretations, your extracts. Question 4 will ask you to, it's the most easy question in the exam paper, describe 2 problems, AO1, all you have to do. Question 5 will always ask you, in what ways were the lives of the German people affected by, and then whatever the issue and the tone of the question is. So we're going to look at how Kaiser Wilhelm's policies affected the German people. Now this question, the concept it targets is change. How were people's lives affected, impacted, changed? In this instance, by the Kaiser's policies. So, Kaiser Wilhelm obviously committed Germany to becoming a major world power. He wanted a world policy, a Welt policy. To do that, Germany had to undergo rapid industrialization. What that meant, of course, is that for a lot of the working, what we call the labouring classes, the proletariat or the workers, whatever term you want to use, that led to some quite tricky living conditions. And increasingly, they looked to the trade unions for strike action, but the Kaiser wanted to clamp down on the trade unions. And increasingly, they looked to the SPD, the socialists, to represent them in the Reichstag. The Kaiser tried to deal with the rise of socialism by introducing reforms such as unemployment insurance, pensions. Has to be said that the welfare system in Germany was very, very well advanced. In fact, it was so good that Winston Churchill went on a fact-finding mission along with Lloyd George to Germany in the early 20th century to look at the welfare system that had been put in place there. So the Kaiser tried to tackle the growing discontent by ensuring that there was, pensions and sickness insurance and those type of safety nets in place. But he also used repression. He cracked down on trade unions. He even said he believed that the trade union leaders should be shot. Now, in terms of the middle classes and small business people, they experienced mixed fortunes under Kaiser Wilhelm. The middle classes, of course, enjoyed a sense of stability and prestige, and many were, politically loyal. But because of the process of large-scale industrialization, like in any city, we start to see kind of monopolies, and it was very difficult for small businesses to compete with these sort of growing, I guess, conglomerates, as we would say in today's parlance. All right. So, the middle classes enjoyed some stability and prosperity with the regime, but there was that concern that small businesses, and we're not just talking shops, we're talking small enterprise, small engineering companies, those type of things, were being kind of swallowed up by these sort of larger industrial enterprises. Now, the Junkers, we've already mentioned them. These were the sort of like the kind of the old traditional landowning elite. They were many of them came from Prussia. Many of them enjoyed sort of, a privileged position within the parliamentary system within the Reichstag. They dominated the Bundesrat, which was the council that existed above the elected Reichstag. And they were, of course, very conservative and strong supporters of Wilhelm's policies. They were also supporting the Kaiser in his resistance to many of the changes that were being tabled by the more progressive groups in the Reichstag. So they were very kind of reactionary, very sort of resistant to kind of social progress, as it were. Industrialists. Now, this is where we see a real commonality with Nazi Germany. In the Nazi regime, big business were clearly the big winners under Hitler's economic policies. The rearmament, the 5-year plan under Göring, all of that benefited big business like IG Farben and Siemens and all of these big corporations. And the same is true with the Kaiserreich. The naval race with the British, trying to manufacture all of these dreadnoughts to dominate the British Navy. All of those contracts brought in huge wealth to those lucky enough, to be carrying out this essential work for government. So we see, because of the large-scale industrialization, the large-scale mobilization of the military, this arms race with Britain that's going on in the years leading up to the First World War, the big industrialists enjoy a very privileged position within the old Kaiserreich. And of course, they subjected their workers to pretty harsh conditions, and they were fully on board with the Kaiser when he talked about closing down the trade unions. The last thing they wanted was their workers going on strike. So this is the question 5, as I've already said. In what ways were the lives of the German people affected by? And the only thing that's ever going to change, obviously, is the issue and the tail of the question. All right, so this is a question about change. It says in what ways. That tells you need to explain more than one way. All right. So good answers, as I've said here, will identify at least 2 examples of how German people's lives were affected by events, and to show the really good answers that shows that not everyone was affected in the same way. And that's the thing with history, isn't it? Good historians will also always look at the diversity of people's experiences. We can all come through the same events, but we might all, we might not recollect them or feel about them in the same way. I used to say, for many people, look at our experiences in COVID. For some people, it was the best of times. For some people, it was the worst of times. All right. I've spoken to people that absolutely loved those lockdowns in the summer months where they didn't have to go to work and spent all day, walking around. For me personally, I hated it. It was awful. But that shows, doesn't it, that we can all be affected by the same things, but experience it in different ways. So good answers to this question will be able to differentiate people's experiences. Now, so I've got you started here. In what ways were the lives of the German people affected by the policies of Kaiser Wilhelm in the years, remember, to 1914? So we're not going into the First World War. This question is capped to before the war breaks out. So, big point. I've decided to focus on German workers here, socialists and trade unions. They were significantly affected by the policies of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Okay, factually correct, but that does nothing more than state a very general point. So we need to back it up. So evidence, you could say, well, many German workers benefited from the Kaiser's social reforms. Sunday working was banned. Children under the age of 13 of age could no longer be employed. Workers and pension insurance schemes were extended. So similar to what we've looked at recently, isn't it, empowering the people with factory reform. Now that's a level 2 response because there's point and evidence. But as yet, the explanation is not fully developed. It's implicit. What you need to then do is use those connecting sentences to say, this was important because this shows that, to develop it into a proper point, evidence, explain. So that's what you're going to have a go at over the next 5 minutes. All right, you've got your point, you've got the evidence about the social reforms. Okay, you've got your textbooks. No, I'll quickly give those out in a second. How did people's lives change, or how were they affected by the social reforms that the Kaiser introduced? Okay, 5 minutes. See if we can do that. Textbooks, you can use page 13 if you need it. Okay, 13. Sure. Page 13. Okay. So I guess what you're really doing when you do the evidence build, so the explain. At A level, I would frame that more as analysis, because what you're doing is effectively making sense of the evidence that you've already presented and showing why it's significant to the question that you're answering. Being able to do this is really important. This is how you get from level 2 in the mark scheme into your level 3s and level 4s. So in the context of an 8-mark question, if you've got at least one fully developed, in this case, change, then that can catapult you to at least level 3, 5 marks out of 8. And if you're running out of time in the exam, but you know you're able to do, well, I can get to 5 marks because I'm able to explain one developed point, I think it's important to hold on to. If you do 2 fairly well developed points, you're going to get to 6 marks. If you then start to get into the complexity, particularly showing how people's lives are affected in different ways, so you've got that complex thinking, that's again that's going to get you into the level 4, 7 to 8 marks. I have to say, when I was sometimes when I do standardization with the exam board, I see answers that I would put into level 4, and I think they've been a bit stingy because they say, well, no, it's level 3, 6. It's not quite developed. So sometimes, how the mark scheme can be applied changes from year to year depending on the standard that the exam board set at the standardisation meeting. Okay, we are going to wrap that activity up. Hopefully you've had a few minutes just to consider how you would link the evidence presented to the issue, which of course is how did this affect people's lives? Again, we go back to this idea of just, using these connecting sentences to make sense of the evidence we've presented, why it's important to the issue in the question. So how did this affect people's lives? All right, so as a result of these reforms, this meant that this shows that the Kaiser's policies had a positive effect. Okay, just those tight, those simple little connecting sentences, can just get you thinking about, okay, why is the evidence that I provided, why is it important to the question? How is it answering the question? And that can turn an explanation which is implicit, capped at level 2, into a developed explanation which is explicit, which can then move into level 3 of the mark scheme. Okay, folks, we're going to, for the last sort of 25 minutes or so, we're going to move on. We're moving into looking at conflicts and tension between East and West. Now, there's a little activity you can have a go at in your own time here for the origins of the Cold War. I think it's important to revisit that. How did the Cold War come about? Who was more responsible? Was it Stalin? Was it Truman? Looking at being able to explain the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, of course, how that prompted Churchill to make his famous Iron Curtain speech, which of course then influenced the shaping of the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine itself was antagonistic towards the Soviet Union, so that encouraged Stalin to be more aggressive in the attempted blockade of Berlin in 1948. So that's something you could and should be doing in your own time as part of your wider revision. And I will be setting those type of activities increasingly as extra, parts of your homework when we come back after half term. We are going to look at the essay question, so another essay question for conflicts and tension in the context of Cold War tensions in the 1950s. Now, this is something that comes up quite regularly. I think in terms of the last few years, the exam board have asked either about, the essay question is either focused on Cold War tensions in the 1960s or Cold War tensions in the 1950s. Now, exactly the same principles apply to essay writing that we've already discussed. So for those of you really looking to, for the higher grades, your essay should set out a line of argument. It should have a logical structure. A judgment should be present throughout the essay, and obviously your judgment should be fully substantiated. Now, in this type of essay, they're going to be asking you, it's a causal based essay. The focus is on, okay, what's been the main sort of reason Cold War tensions have flared up, whether that's from 1945 to 1949, whether that's across the 1950s, whether it's across the 1960s. And heaven forbid, they might even ask you a question about, what was the most important reason for détente up to 1972. That's for a future revision lesson. Okay, so like Power and the People, whatever factor they've given you, whatever cause that they've given you in the question, that's what you start with. So, for example, they say, the Korean War was the most important reason for Cold War, for the increasing Cold War tensions in the 1950s. So you must start with the Korean War, and then you would look at other factors. If it's a question on the 1960s, they might give you the Berlin Wall was the most important reason for Cold War tensions in the 1960s. So that's what you start with. And then, of course, you go on to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, Prague Spring, etc. All right, so the golden rule of essay writing. For those of you who are ambitious or want the higher grades, remember, this is an essay, double the time, double the length. So if an 8-mark question, 2p paragraphs, an essay question should be at least 4 paragraphs in length, shouldn't it? It just stands to reason. So, we are going to have a look at this question up here, which is a variation on a previous question. So previously, they have always framed the question as, they've always put they've put the Korean War in twice now as the stated factor. I do hope the board will kind of be a little bit more, will vary it up a little bit. So if they're going to ask us again about Cold War tensions in the 50s, they could well, as I've done here, give you the stated factor of the arms race. Now, very quickly, I've asked you, what skill, concept is this question targeting? We've already agreed that the primary concept in this type of question is cause, because they're asking you, okay, what's the reason why Cold War tensions are increased? So we're really looking at causes and obviously to a degree consequences as well. What happened as a result of this event? How did it escalate tensions? So I've given you the arms race. I want, over the next minute, see if you can, and I'll quickly walk around the class. So obviously we can do this as once I've stopped recording, we can do it as a Q&A towards the end. I'm going to just quickly walk around and see what you're writing down. But I want you very quickly to jot down what were the other major Cold War flashpoints of the 1950s. I'll give you 1 minute to jot that down, and I'll come around in about 30 seconds to see what you're writing. chronology. Remember the 1950s? I think I've just seen someone write the Berlin blockade. That's 1948 to 1949. This is where good understanding of chronology is all important. Because if you bring something into the essay, you spend a whole paragraph discussing how this event escalated tensions, but it doesn't sit within the time frame, you won't lose marks. You won't gain any either. And you'd have wasted 5 minutes at least of your time. So that's where a sound understanding of chronology is really important. You must make sure whatever you submit fits within the time period given. Many of the students got that wrong over the years, particularly the mock exams. I mean, that's what the mocks are all about, isn't it? You know, making sure we get those mistakes out of our system. But it is quite demoralising, you know, particularly when you've worked hard and you've made a real good fist of it. You know, you've made a real good case why this is really important for the question, and then questions at the end, yeah, and then I've got it wrong. This, you know, I've talked about the U2 crisis, but it didn't happen until 1960. So it doesn't, you know, yes, there's a little bit of flexibility, of course there is, but by and large, you know, and of course, without shouting at it, put your hands up. Who has put down the Hungarian uprising? Excellent. How many students get that confused with the Prague Spring of 1968? Very similar. Soviet tanks roll in, people are killed, leaders arrested. Important thing, of course, Imre Nagy was executed in the wake of the Hungarian uprising. Alexander Dubček was not. But that's a common misunderstanding. Okay, show of hands. How many people have also cited the space race for this question? Excellent. That's a really good one, because the space race and the arms race are two sides of the same coin, as we'll get to in a moment. How many people have cited the Korean War? Right, if you haven't, it must go down. Really important. Think about what the Korean War does. When China enters the war against the UN, General MacArthur, who's leading the UN war effort, threatens to use the atom bomb against China. It is the first major proxy war between the superpowers. Stalin has funded and equipped the North Koreans. So this is when the Cold War not only is getting hot, as it were, but also threatens to become nuclear. Really important. So I would suggest those would be your main factors. In any question on the Cold War tensions in the 1950s. So your stated factor is the arms race. How did that make the Cold War more dangerous? Now again, like in our Power and the People essay, you've got to show nuanced thinking. You've got to remember how to show evidence of complex thinking about how these factors knit together. The arms race made the Cold War incredibly dangerous. Now, some students might be tempted to then sort of look ahead to what happens in Cuba in 1962. I'm not sure I would credit that, because the question is capped to the 1950s. What you can show, though, is, again, cause and effect here. The Korean War, not only was it dangerous because it threatened to make the Cold War hotter, and obviously MacArthur did threaten the bomb against the Chinese, but that in itself, after 1953, how does the US respond? The war ends in stalemate. No decisive victory. Okay, both sides, you know, Korea is still partitioned today at the 39th parallel. There's a demarcation line, probably one of the most dangerous zones in the world, where lots of people who crossed it have been killed. It ends in a stalemate. How does the United States respond? by spending huge amounts of money on weapons and defense. So as a result of the Korean War, the arms race becomes even more dangerous, cause and effect. Now, also out of the arms race, of course, comes the space race. So this is what you've got to do for this question, is think about how the factors are related, how they knit together. So, there's a few pointers here. The arms race quickly extends into a space race. Questions at the end. Do you need the... The arms race extends into a space race. Okay? And the space race makes the arms race more dangerous. The Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite in low Earth orbit. It frightens the life out of the Americans because that can be weaponized. How does America respond? They create NASA. Then it becomes about who can get to the moon first, who can get into low Earth orbit. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first cosmonaut in space. That type of, the capabilities of those rockets, powerful enough to leave the atmosphere of the Earth, that becomes the technology that ICBMs are based on. What is an intercontinental ballistic missile? It's a rocket. All right. So the space, not only does the not only does this the arms race lead to the space race, but the technology in the space race makes the arms race more dangerous. All right. Okay. The Saturn V rocket sending astronauts to the moon. That's a missile that can be turned into a missile that can be launched from one continent into another continent. Hence, that's what an intercontinental ballistic missile is. So the space race makes the arms race more dangerous. That's the type of thing I want you juggling around in your conclusion when you're thinking about how these factors are connected. I think we can all agree there are things in the 50s which don't really destabilise the goal of the Hungarian uprising. It's fairly limited, isn't it? Yes, it's condemned by President Eisenhower, but Eisenhower's never going to send American troops behind the Iron Curtain. All right, it's condemned by the UN. All right, the UN Security Council. Obviously, the Russians use their veto, so nothing can be really done. So, whilst that's a humanitarian crisis, it doesn't really do a lot to create tensions between superpowers. So, the factors to really look for in this type of essay question are clearly the Korean War, which is dangerous in itself, but the consequence of that is to ignite the arms race even more. And obviously then the arms race makes the Cold War incredibly dangerous. We have the development of the hydrogen bomb, and by the end of the 1950s, the Russians are now basically putting nuclear warheads on missiles. So we go from these sort of, the strategic bombers where nuclear weapons are carried by, the B-29s and the B-52s, which are constantly in flight, around the world. We are moving from that era where bombs have to be carried and dropped to when they can be basically connected, or where missiles can be weaponized with a nuclear warhead, and we're into this era of remote warfare. So it makes the Cold War more dangerous, far more dangerous. Show of hands, it's just where do we stand on this issue? Who would say the arms race was probably the most important development in the Cold War in the 50s? Put your hands right up so I can see. A few of you, put your hands up if you think perhaps the Korean War was the most dangerous development. Okay, one of you. Space race. Or there's a lot of people sitting on the fence right now, isn't there? Perhaps people are not quite sure. Okay, so what you can do for the last 15 minutes is to complete the plan that I've put on the board there. I can come round and give you some textbooks to help you with that. Whatever you don't manage to do today, obviously you can finish as part of your wider revision and preparation for the mock exams. I'm going to stop the recording there. So obviously we can have the Q&A as well. And you've got the last 15 minutes to do as much of that plan as you can.